Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 177, Being Sherlock.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello and welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And I am being Scott Monty this time around. What do you think of that?
I think that's really, you do a wonderful Scott Monty impression.
It's my best one. My best impression.
It really is, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I love the way you sign checks, with his name.
Well, we hope that we will leave a positive and firm impression on you folks for this episode. We're about to welcome our guest. But before we do, just wanted to remind you that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose177. That'll take you to our homepage, specific notes for this show, at ihearofsherlock.com, which is where you can leave us a comment in the show notes there. You can also email us, of course, at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can find us on all of the social networks as I Hear of Sherlock. And, of course, you can call us. We do have the line open forever and ever to receive your voicemails. And we do thank you for submissions. 774-221-READ. Again, 774-221-7323. That's the line for leaving us a voicemail. We do thank you for that. And we ask you to support the show however you can. We do have a bit of an update with regard to support of the show. We pledged that once we got a support of $100 per episode through Patreon, through a number of folks, this is a community effort after all, that when we reach that $100 an episode amount, we would begin doing transcripts for those that are hearing impaired. And we are proud and pleased to announce that we have reached that, thanks to a donor that put us over the top. However, we still do have an archive to go through, so it would be great if you won't forget about us and help us to go about doing that transcription process for our previous episodes as well. So just click on the Patreon link or become a patron link on our homepage and see how you can support the show. Thanks. Ashley Polasek holds a doctorate in the study of Sherlock Holmes. That's right, kids. You too can grow up and get a PhD in Sherlock Holmes. It's on the study of Sherlock Holmes on screen, and it's a subject that she has certainly been a noted expert on, as she's spoken really across the world, U.S., U.K., Europe, and she is a member of the Baker Street Babes. So, we have been very fortunate to have Ashley on the show, not one, not two, but 4 times before. We'll mention those episodes throughout, and we are pleased to welcome her back to the program to talk about her new book. Ashley, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to my my 5-time frequent flyer pin.
There's got to be some kind of pentagram or something that we celebrate around. I don't know. I don't know. That sounds kind of cultish. Although,
how about a pair of iHose branded socks?
Ooh.
Oh, I like that.
Well, maybe that's something we should start to think about for the holiday season. I think
and
you're onto something.
And if you give one sock for every appearance, then I will have 5 socks.
You'll have 5 socks.
That's great. One for each of my feet.
That's great.
You know, we need to do that on trifles. We need to do socks in the Canon.
That's a good one.
We can do that right before we do clothespins.
These are very short shows, very trifling shows. Well, Ashley, let's take a stroll down memory lane since you've been with us 5 times now. We won't bore people with how you first heard about Sherlock Holmes, but let's reminisce with us about how we came into contact with you, how our listeners would have first come into contact with you over the years. Do you remember where it all began?
Sure. I think my first appearance with you was on your Jeopardy episode.
That was a lot of fun. I think that was episode 70.
Yeah, that was great fun. I was in such hysterics by the end. I think I just forgot even what my own name was. So that was quite fun.
Yeah.
And I was with you for, I'm trying to think of the order. I guess I was with you for the BSI Press Behind the Canonical Screen book, which I co-edited with Lindsay Fay, and she and I appeared on the show together.
Now, was that your first Sherlockian book?
The first one where my name was on the cover, I would say.
Okay.
I've appeared in other places, in chapters and so forth, in other people's books.
Got it.
And then I was with you for the P.G. Wodehouse book. My name was not on the cover of that, but I did make it exist, which I was very proud of. I edited that book, and we talked about Sherlock Holmes and P.G. Wodehouse.
Yeah.
And then most recently, about a year ago, I chatted with you briefly about my presentation at the From Gillette to Brett conference in Bloomington.
That's right. And it's interesting because I think what we saw from that presentation in Bloomington really formed the basis, from what I can understand, of how you put your book together. And the book, for those who have not heard yet, is Being Sherlock, a Sherlockian's Stroll Through the Best Sherlock Holmes Stories, and it's put out by Lyons Press. So remind us a little bit about that journey you took us on in Bloomington.
The presentation I gave you there was about television technologies and how they influence the way a story is told on screen. And I did 3 different versions of the 6 Napoleons and how they'd been adapted in different eras with respect to what technology was available for television production at the time.
Right.
So adaptation studies is my area, and that was kind of pulling on one of those threads.
And that's probably one of those things that you could have taken the template of that presentation and applied it across any number of tales as they've been brought to the screen, right?
Absolutely, yes. That one's particularly interesting because it's television technology, and generally we think of Sherlock Holmes more. When we say Sherlock Holmes on screen, we're usually defaulting to film, but of course film technology and TV technology are very different. So using short stories that are directly put on screen on television was quite a nice comparison to be able to make.
Yeah. So when you think about the best Sherlock Holmes stories, I mean, that's a loaded term, first of all.
It is.
How did you approach that kind of explosive and I'm sure controversial topic?
Well, it wasn't easy. I came at it from 2 angles. I started with a list of the obvious stories I knew I had to include. So there may be 4 or 5 of them that I think most Sherlockians you talk to would agree. You can't make a collection of best stories that doesn't include A Scandal in Bohemia or The Speckled Band. Those are going to be in there. And then I came at the other angle and I made a list of the entire canon, and I started crossing off stories that I knew really didn't need to go in my list of the best. So you cross off the blanched soldier and you cross off the creeping man, and eventually you come to a middle ground where there are sort of 15 or so stories vying for maybe 6 or 7 spots. And at that point, I called in the cavalry and started talking to other Sherlockians who could provide their opinions and say, ooh, this one and not that one, and make a case for one over the other.
So how many did you end up choosing in the end?
Well, the book contains 11 stories, 10 short stories plus The Hound of the Baskervilles. And originally, I went back to look at my contract before I set up to join you guys. And the contract specifies 12 to 15 stories, but it also specified, I think, 85,000 words. And ultimately, I would only have been able to do that if I hadn't used The Hound of the Baskervilles, and I felt a collection of the best stories. I would have felt remiss if I hadn't included Hound. So I asked them, could I do 10 short stories? And it still wound up having the book be much longer than they'd originally contracted, but my editors at Lyons Press were very kind and said, yes, we want you to include Hound. We certainly don't want to cut the number of short stories under 10, so we'll just make the book longer.
So where was the original spark of the idea for the book? Was that rooted in your observation about adaptations and media studies? Because, your sort of fundamental principle is that as technology for film and television production has changed, the way Sherlock Holmes stories are interpreted, presented, shown on the screen also changes from, sort of a straight proscenium where you might follow the events of a story and observe Sherlock Holmes to, as cameras become smaller and production moves out into real locations, stories in which Holmes features and the narrative gets really transformed. I mean, was that sort of the start? Did you sort of start there and then say, gee, I wonder how I could apply that to these stories, or was it something else?
Well, I'm going to answer that question in 2 parts. The first is that you're right about part of my central thesis there, though it's not just about technology. It's about all the ways that a story might be pressured to change. So not only technology alters the story, but we alter the story. So if you have an audience who wants to see The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1959, they fundamentally want a different presentation of the story than an audience in 2001. And so that changes as well. So people's politics makes the story change. Whatever happens to be politically going on in the world, whatever happens to be socially going on in the world or culturally going on in the world, these all change the story. So those are all part of what I talk about. As for the practical consideration, there's a kind of part 2 of what inspired the book. What inspired the book was I got an email from an editor at Lyons Press who said, I was on Sherlockian Who's Who, and I found your name, and we really want to do a Sherlock Holmes book. We want somebody who can curate it and who can potentially talk about adaptations that sounds a lot like you. Would you do it?
Wow.
And I developed it from there, but I was solicited from the press.
That's wonderful. I mean, Bert and I are usually on the Sherlockian Who Cares.
Yes, I'm on that side of the list often as well.
But what a wonderful testament to your reputation, in not only in the Sherlockian world, but in terms of your editing capabilities as well. Because I think I shared this with you privately some months ago. I was at Elliot Milstein's house earlier this year, and Elliot, of course, is one of the co-authors of the Woodhouse book that we talked with you about back in episode 143. And he was very clear and very effusive in his praise that he said the book would not have been what it was if it were not for you, if it were not for the editorial eye that you brought to it and took what was going to be a very perfunctory and maybe in some ways sleepy kind of tome and really turned it into this dialogue between friends and really brought it to life.
Well, that's very kind. And I was very grateful to be able to do work for Curtis and Elliot and help them create something that they were really proud of. And editing is, that's what I do in my real life. I do a lot of work. I've been teaching composition to college students for a decade. So being able to put those skills to the test and show that I can execute the things I'm teaching is very important to me to do that well.
And talk about that a little bit, because I think a lot of people understand very easily what the job of an author or a journalist or a writer is, somebody who puts words together. But how would you describe the job of editing? How is it fundamentally different, and what kind of approach do you have to take?
I think that the idea of curation is very important to an editor. So being able to determine what matters and what doesn't matter in this whole pool of very interesting material. So for instance, you asked me how I decided what stories to go in. Well, there are several stories. I think we can agree there were only like 6 Sherlock Holmes plots, right? So there were a couple stories where I wanted to make sure that each introduction and each story I included said something different about the canon. And there were a couple stories like Solitary Cyclists and The Copper Beeches that are quite similar to each other fundamentally when it comes to structure and theme. And I ultimately said, well, even though I love both of those stories and I have things to say about both stories, if I'm speaking to an audience, if I'm writing to an audience of people who are using this collection, these 11 stories, as a kind of way to get into Sherlock Holmes, or they're trying to learn something new about Sherlock Holmes when they've read these stories over and over again, I want to be able to curate the collection in such a way that I can talk about something radically different with each introduction. So the collection includes the Solitary Cyclist, but doesn't include the Copper Beeches. And I think that kind of curatorial job is very important to it. The writing part of it, where you sit down and say, what's actually going to go in it? How do I make the sentences sound good? That's a different skill set to editing. That's that's an authorial skill set, which I sometimes I'm good at. I only do nonfiction, so you're going to be hard pressed to kind of come to me and say, "Will you write a short story?" No, I haven't the faintest idea how to do that. That's not at all what I can do. But writing nonfiction is something I can do, and then I have to go through and do copy editing very heavily to make sure that I don't sound like the boring, windy academic that I really am.
So how do you approach that with your students? I mean, I would imagine the red pen obviously comes out, but with students who are just learning compositional writing, who are just learning these skills, how does that approach differ from, say, when you're editing, for example, Curtis and Elliot's book? They should join together and just become Curtis. But between Curtis and Elliot's book, and obviously, the entire rearrangement of the missives was an important part of it. But how do you approach that from beginners versus seasoned writers?
Often, beginner writers and seasoned writers have some of the same troubles. And really, the biggest sort of categories of problems, the things that are most difficult to teach, are thinking clearly, because the idea that I know what I mean, I just can't say it, is actually nonsense. If you can't express something, if you can't communicate it, you actually don't know what you mean. So learning how to understand what you mean first and then put it on the page, that's challenge number one, and that comes from trying to break down and understand critical thinking skills. And then number 2 is understanding that there's a great temptation to try to show what we know or how smart we are by the complexity of our writing. And the fact is that it is really, really easy to make a simple idea sound very complicated by using overwrought prose and fancy vocabulary, but a really good communicator, somebody who is challenging themselves to express themselves clearly and be concise, has the ability to make a complicated thing seem simple. So you can understand something that perhaps you wouldn't have had access to before. That's the challenge. So teaching people to strip down and understand the essential meaning of what they're trying to say and not make it overly complex. That's the task. And it's a task I have to constantly practice myself.
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, you've done it really well, and let's talk a little bit about sort of one example of that in this book. One of the insights that you bring to the story. I mean, the first thing we should say is that for each one of these stories, you have an introduction that's really much more than an introduction. It's sort of a wonderful exploration of the way the characters have been brought to life in different representations. So in that way, it harkens back to what you talked about at Gillette to Brett. But it's also, as you said earlier, looking at the form of the story, the way the narrative sort of plays out. But it's really very interesting. And let's sort of take a look at the Speckled Band as an example, because in your introduction for the Speckled Band, you point out that one of the things that we really enjoy about the cases of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson is that they are friends who have adventures together. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you thought about the Speckled Band and how that has been evidenced?
Sure. I think that that is the difference between detective stories or crime fiction and adventure stories. And there's a reason that the majority of tales in the canon are called the adventure of something or other. That has to do with the characters going on a journey where they face danger. That's a sort of broad definition of adventure as a genre. And I think that is what is more important to us as readers when we encounter Sherlock Holmes stories. That's more important to us than the mystery, the central mystery, because you can only encounter the mystery once as a mystery. After that, you know the solution. And so anytime you encounter the story, you already know the ending, and you may engage with the mystery and you may look for the clues in different ways, but you know how it pans out. So you can never experience it again as mysterious. But you can always re-experience the adventure, because every time you go back to the beginning of the tale, the characters are in danger again. And the suspense is there, and the joy of their relationship and the kind of emotional attachment that we have to them when we know that they're in danger. That's where the joy of understanding their relationship and understanding the tales comes from. And Speckled Band is a great example of that, because you can read the beginning of the story. This is what I say in the introduction. You can read the beginning of the story and you may have a kind of intellectual interest in her tale, in Helen Stoner's tale. But it isn't until Roylott comes in and threatens Holmes that you go, ooh, I'm ready for this. This is going to be a good one. And that moment, every time you reread the story, that moment is great all over again.
We like it. That's why we use it for our introduction on the show.
It's a good choice.
Yeah. Well, it's dramatic. So thinking about Conan Doyle's own skill as a writer and as a self-editor, because we look through his manuscripts and we can see that he actually had very few edits in most of his works. With your experience as an editor, how would you say you might have taken the pen to his work, or is it just perfect the way it is?
I think Conan Doyle has the virtue of being remarkably concise, particularly for the time period in which he was writing. So if you compare the Sherlock Holmes tales to sort of standard realism genre Victorian fiction, you find that Conan Doyle really wasn't wordy at all. He painted pictures with a sentence that it might take Charles Dickens chapters to paint. And I love Charles Dickens, and his character portraits are wonderful. But if you open up and you read The Blue Carbuncle, you have a cast of lots of characters in there, and they're all unique and interesting and specific, and you get a feel for each of them, and you're in the moment with each of those characters, which is an incredible skill. And like I said, making something complex feel simple, being able to distill somebody's character down that well in such a short format is really an impressive skill. So I wouldn't dare to take a pen to Conan Doyle.
Well, I was hoping you'd say that, but I have to test the waters.
Yes, there you're testing my character. No, I wouldn't.
Well, and as you look at a single story, like you did in Bloomington, how and as the adaptations have come along over the years of a single story, and if you want to go with Six Napoleons, fine. If you want to pick another one, go right ahead. But how would you say the writing and editing process that has brought Holmes to various size screens in the ensuing years has changed? How has the whether it's the cinematographer or the director, how has their approach to Sherlock Holmes changed over the years?
I think it often reflects where our interests are in other stories. So you can see concurrence between the kind of Sherlock Holmes we have, the post-millennial version of the Holmes character, right? So Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller. You can see a concurrence between that version of the character and the kind of anti-hero, sort of tense superhero, kind of Christian Bale Batman kind of character, right? That isn't the same kind of Sherlock Holmes that you get with Basil Rathbone, who is very much a kind of untouchable paragon. And the question you can ask yourself is, well, what's the difference between what's going on in the world in the 2000s versus what was going on in the world in the 1940s? Well, that's a pretty easy, obvious sort of answer, right? We want a hero who can put all of the pieces back together because the world was falling apart. And now we have this kind of need for psychologically complex anti-hero characters for whatever reason. There are lots of reasons that we tend to that kind of character now. But the way we interpret Sherlock Holmes is going to follow those kinds of trends. Sometimes it's going to lead those kinds of trends rather than follow them. And I think that you find that Sherlock Holmes kind of operates as a cultural constant. You can sort of plug in at any time and go, okay, what kind of Sherlock Holmes are we getting right now, and why do we want that particular version of it? And it's not always just about Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes it's about the way the story is told. Do we care more about the mystery? Do we want more in the atmosphere of the tale? Do we have the budget? Sometimes it's practical. Do we have the budget to be able to go out and do lots of big fancy location shooting? Or do we have a really small budget and everything has to be rewritten in such a way that it takes place inside the same room, redressed 4 different times? There are so many different things that can change the way the story is told.
The ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex is looking forward to the fall harvest, when our peasants work in our fields, cut timber, haul water, spin and weave, and we collect their tithes, every 10th egg, sheaf of wheat, lamb, chicken, and all the other animals. The peasant's lot is hard, but you can relax with your copy of a curious collection of dates through the year with Sherlock Holmes, highlighting every day with significant events from the Sherlockian universe. Available right now from our WessexPress.com. No faint and hesitating trill, such tribute as to winter chill the lonely redbreast pays, clear, loud, and lively is the din from social warblers gathering in. But you can tune it all out when you reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press provides. Choose yours today. Now, What went into one of the things that surprised me in the book was the selection of Abbey Grange. What went into your thinking about Abbey Grange?
Oh, I love the Abbey Grange. It may be my very favorite story.
Really?
Yes, my Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes investiture is Miss Mary Fraser.
Uh-huh.
And there are a couple of reasons I think the story is wonderful. One is I think it has one of the most marvelous Sherlock Holmes heaves himself around the room looking for clues detection scenes. I love that. But I think thematically it's really important because it speaks to a kind of deeper cultural issue that was going on in the kind of public discourse, which was the need for divorce reform and women's rights. And it is a wonderfully kind of feminist tale of a woman who has been abused, and she has had a great deal of fortitude in the face of being married to an absolute monster. I mean, he set her dog on fire. That's a bad guy. And she has the presence of mind to be able to concoct a story that for a detail that was not even her fault. You know, she and her maid concoct a story that pretty much fools Sherlock Holmes, the greatest mind. So that's wonderful. And then they're able to stand up to his questioning to try to hold themselves together so that she can protect the man she loves. And then ultimately, at the end, she gets to find a kind of freedom and satisfaction because her monster of a husband is gone. She's left inheriting his estate, and she gets to walk away with a sailor just for fun at the end. It doesn't get any better than that.
Oh boy, I love the way you look at that.
Yeah.
You know, one of the nice things too in your introduction, you put your finger on it, and this is a real characteristic of Holmes, you know, that we've talked about from time to time. I mean, Holmes will occasionally let someone who has actually committed a crime go, as he did with Dr. Leon Sterndale. But you know, there are occasionally events in the cases of Sherlock Holmes where, as you put it, justice and law are at odds.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we see that in a couple of different cases. Certainly in the Devil's Foot, as you say. It's certainly true in the Abbey Grange. It's true in Blue Carbuncle, depending on how you define how just his decision ultimately was. I think he was looking at a kind of greater justice, or at least a kind of greater good there. And I think that those are deep moral questions. So one of the things I hope comes across if you read the book cover to cover, it's meant so that you can dip in and you can read an introduction and you can read a story at your leisure. But if you read the whole thing and you read all the introductions, I hope that a broader story coalesces about how these are not mere works of throwaway pop fiction. And even Conan Doyle sort of was prone to think of them that way. But they have this wonderful resonance and deep thematic meaning, and they can prompt you to really consider some important questions that can affect who you are as a person. What would you do if you held the key to putting a murderer in prison, but you knew that your sympathies were on the side of the murderer? It's the same thing in Charles Augustus Milverton, right? When the law and justice come into conflict, and you're sort of forced to ask yourself, what would I do? Would I have the courage to break the law and stand for justice? And the fact that Sherlock Holmes does that, I think, is always inspiring to me. As he says, in all the cases, he's never used his powers on the wrong side.
Well, you know, the powers of Sherlock Holmes and their evidence in the cases, I mean, this is a great nicely curated collection because it shows us different examples about that.
Thank you.
But when you get through, you know, the short stories in your book, you have the joy of coming up with the Hound.
Yes.
At the end. And one of the things you point out in your introduction is that ever since 1921, there's been a new major representation, a new major production, a new major film event of the Hound of the Baskervilles every 7 years. And it's just the approaches, as you pointed out, reflect a lot of what's going on at the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a wonderful, terrific Gothic story, and there's so many of these stories that really have these Gothic elements. But do you feel that it sort of all comes together in the Hound? Do you think of the Hound as sort of justifiably iconic for Holmes and Watson?
I do. I think the Hound does something that none of the other stories do. It is unique in the canon in that, of course, it's a long work as opposed to the short stories. And Sherlock Holmes, I do think, ultimately works best in short form. But the reason we keep going back to Hound is because of the novellas. It's the one that maintains a continuous narrative. So even though Holmes is absent in the middle third, the story stays with Watson. And because it stays with Watson, it stays with Holmes. So we have this very naturally cinematic tale. And if you speak to people who have actually done the creative labor of adapting Hound, and I've spoken to several, they will talk about how naturally this story translates to stage and to screen, because it's just so clear in the way it's told. It's vibrant in its atmosphere. The characters are all well drawn with Conan Doyle's usual kind of acuity to get right to the heart of an interesting character. And it has that kind of those Gothic elements that make it, as Conan Doyle said, a real creeper. It is. And you can watch any adaptation of the Hound, and even the very worst ones you will watch and be enthralled by the story that's being told, or by the way it's being told. There isn't a single version of Hound I've ever seen that I wanted to just turn off halfway through. There are some I haven't ever wanted to go rewatch again, but there aren't any I didn't want to watch all the way through at least once.
Really? That includes the Stuart Granger?
It includes the Stuart Granger, which may be the worst.
Well, if only to see William Shatner die at the end.
Well, quite. It's the sloppiest transcription of the narrative of any version I've seen. I think if you had not read the story, you would not be able to follow even remotely what was going on. And also, they clearly had no budget, so every outdoor scene takes place under the same sort of plastic tree, which is, it's just, but you have to watch it for the sense of completeness, and also to see how you can take this story and just tear it to pieces. I love even the bad ones, even Tom Baker, which was the slowest, and that one's the painful one where you sort of in the middle get up and go make a sandwich and come back and go, oh God, are we still in this scene? Why are we here?
Now, as you look across your curated list here, I know over the years we have seen a number of lists of quote-unquote favorite stories, and it of course got its origin in I think it was a contest that the publishers of the Strand magazine did in the 1920s. They asked Conan Doyle to come up with his list of favorite stories. Do you have any story on your list that did not appear on Conan Doyle's original list?
There are, and in fact, I have the spreadsheet next to me that I originally made when I thought I was going to be able to include 15 stories, and I have sort of all my notes and my little sort of one-word cues about why this one is unique in the list, and I have included those ranks next to it, though my notes are all scribbly and I can't remember exactly what all my numbers mean, but Conan Doyle had Speckled Band, Red-Headed League, Scandal in Bohemia, Blue Carbuncle, Bruce Partington Plans, Dancing Men, Silver Blaze. So Conan Doyle included Silver Blaze, and I did not include Silver Blaze, so it was on my original list. It was one of the few that got cut out. And then Solitary Cyclist is not. So if you look at all those lists, which if you go on the internet, somebody has done a collation of all those lists. I can't remember who did that labor, but it's there. Solitary Cyclist comes in at sort of about a third of the way down Sherlockians' favorite lists. Abbey Grange, same thing, comes about a third of the way down those lists. Devil's Foot usually ranks really highly. It was originally on my list, and it didn't make it in either. It was one of the couple that sort of got left out.
You're breaking Bert's heart.
I know. Well, it broke my heart too. And as I said, if you read the general introduction to the book, I do say there isn't ever going to be a time where I open this book and I don't berate myself for which stories I left out. Not that I'd replace any of the ones I had to include. I would just, write an appendix. So,
you're missing, volume 2.
There you go.
Missing the next publishing opportunity.
Well, I'll tell you what, I have toyed with the idea with a co-author who I won't name at this time, but of doing a collection of the Stroll through the worst Sherlock Holmes stories, where you pick the dozen least defensible stories and in earnest write introductions about those stories. So that would be a fun kind of companion volume, I think.
Huh. Well, I think there's really something here. I mean, we've got volume 1 is the best Sherlock Holmes stories. The ones that barely missed the list, you could do volume 2, the better Sherlock Holmes stories. And then you've got room for volume 3, which is the mediocre Sherlock Holmes stories.
The Red-Headed League of Stepchildren stories?
Yeah. The good Sherlock Holmes stories, and then you can have the worst ones.
The perfectly acceptable.
Right.
Oh, these are the stories that are also here. Yes.
Well, that would be interesting if you did like a forced rank order of having people read the canon, not in chronological order, not in canonically chronological order, but in the order of perhaps worst to best or best to worst.
Yeah, I think you might have to do a worst to best only if they're already Sherlockians.
Just to get them
because
through
if you're trying to capture people's interest, you don't really want to start them off with, the Mazarin Stone, do you?
Oh no! Tell me what went into excluding Silver Blaze. I can tell you kind of what my little codes were about the categories. So I said I was trying to build a kind of complete picture. I want a microcosm of all the things I think make the whole Sherlock Holmes canon wonderful. And I tried not to have too much overlap, and I tried to talk about things that were quite important. So for instance, the Speckled Band, I specifically talk about the structure of the story, and none of the other introductions talk about the story structure as being important. I talk in The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist about Holmes's heroic nature. I use Charles Augustus Milverton to talk about villains in the canon, and there are a couple stories where I talk about genre and how there are sort of crossover genres. So Bruce Partington Plans crosses over into espionage fiction, and you have Gothic, urban Gothic for The Man with a Twisted Lip. And when I got to Silver Blaze, the key that I put there was that the story trope was interesting and the relationship with clients was interesting, but I found myself saying, I'm not sure what to say about this that's unique that I haven't said in my other introductions. So it wasn't I didn't leave it out because the story isn't wonderful. I left it out because I was not up to the task of saying something uniquely interesting about it. I think that was really what it was.
Oh, you underestimate yourself.
Well, let's do volume 2 and we'll see what I can come up with.
Fair enough.
No, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, it has some lovely features of the narrative. It has some iconic quotations. It has some great examinations. One of the things that baffled people when they tried to bring it to the screen, was the denouement, the bringing people to justice part of things. It's not the easiest thing to do with that case.
It's not, and it's a wonderful case. But as you say, one of the most iconic things about it is that it includes some really wonderful lines. And while I do quote some lines in some of my introductions, one of the things I was trying to keep in mind as I was writing them was I was walking I was walking a tightrope in who my audience was. So I wanted to make sure that the book appealed to people who were very familiar with Sherlock Holmes, who could read these introductions and hopefully then read the stories with a fresh set of eyes and maybe see something they hadn't seen before. I wanted to make it interesting to people who were interested in the adaptive history of Sherlock Holmes. So there are lots of images in the introductions, and they talk about the relationships with various adaptations. But I also was keenly aware that this would be the sort of book that people might give to somebody who'd never read a Sherlock Holmes story before. And so it was important to me that I didn't use the introductions in any way to spoil the story. If people read the introduction first, I didn't want them to lose the mystery. So giving away key lines like the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, which is an iconic line, but it gives up the game in the case. And so you would lose the mystery if I used that and started talking about it.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. Well, you're certainly right about the design of the book. I mean, it's a great book. If you know people who would like to know more about Sherlock Holmes, but might be daunted by getting a big book of 60 stories, if you know people who are interested in the movies, who are interested in the various impersonations of Holmes over the years, if you're interested in people who are interested about narrative and adaptation, you've really wrapped it all up in a terrific package here.
Thank you.
So that leaves us to the next logical question. What are you working on next that we can begin to salivate over and anticipate the enjoyment of?
We were talking about The Hound of the Baskervilles, and that is at the center of my next project. I am currently working on a book for our mutual friend, Steve Doyle, over at Wessex Press, and the book is called Hounding the Screen, and it will be a study of every single extant direct adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles. So irrespective of national origin, of medium, so television, film, live action, animated, silent, talkie, they're all going to be in there if they still exist, and there aren't that many that don't exist. Some of them are hard to access, and some of them I'm having to plead with people who speak languages I don't to translate for me. But every chapter will be a different version of the Hound, and analyzing not the production history, but the quality of the adaptation and what it does that's unique and how it tells the story.
Well, that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it. I just returned home a couple days ago from a trip overseas, and I spent a couple of very blissful days in the basement archives of the British Film Institute watching versions of The Hound of the Baskervilles that are only available there. So Eileen Norwood from 1921, silent film, and the Robert Rendell version from 1931, which was surprisingly really, really good. I was delighted by it.
Oh, that's great. Well, Ashley Polasek, author and editor of Being Sherlock, a Sherlockians stroll through the best Sherlock Holmes stories, now available from Lyons Press. Thank you so much for being with us for the 5th time. Let's make it a 6th sometime.
Absolutely. Ask me back. I'll throw another foot for another sock.
Sounds great.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's always interesting to see the takes that different people bring to new books about Sherlock Holmes. And, I think Ashley's take on this is really very, resonant. Well, obviously it would be very resonant to today because there's so many things going on. The interest in how adaptation changes narrative, the great number of dramatizations of the Holmes stories, some of the academic exploration of themes like Gothic literature. And, it's interesting. And she puts all this together really very well in the commentary around some of the stories where she calls out things like Victorian fascination with Gothic themes and the undead, and looks at how different films, like various presentations, for example, of Holmes and Jack the Ripper on the screen have portrayed aspects of that. So there's a lot going on here. It's really very interesting, and it's something I never would have anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got a book that ostensibly includes a lot of original material like this did, I think the deciding factor then is in the curation. The power of the curator. Whether you're talking about an exhibit, and we talked about this recently with Glenn and Ross about the BSI symposium at Lilly. It's all about taking what's in your possession and then arranging it in such a way that a cogent story comes out of it. Now, these are a series of stories, so obviously they stand alone, but the way Ashley has positioned them, right, in order to help us understand why each one is important, where its place is in the bigger picture, in the bigger pantheon of the Sherlock Holmes canon, I think that's what helps it stand apart.
Yeah, well said.
Well, those dulcet tones mean that it is time, once again, to play everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's time for Canonical Couplets. And we'll see how you fared in the last episode, all the way back in episode 176, when we asked you to identify this canonical couplet. Expensive ladies strain the longest purse, and silent watchdogs make things rather worse. Bert, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we were referring to?
Yes, that is the wonderful case about the first female motorist who was a great automobile enthusiast. That's the adventure of Lady Frances's car wax, I think. No,
not even close. No, I see where you were going, Lady Frances Carfax. Well, indeed, that's a good guess, but in fact, we were looking for Silver Blaze.
Oh my goodness,
Silver
I was
Blaze,
so close.
Right, Silent Watchdogs was the key there. Silent Watchdogs. So we had a number of correct entries this time around. We thank you for those, and it looks like the prize this time is going to. Oh, gotta get the prize wheel out here before I can actually identify who it is. Okay, here we go. Now, there we give it a spin, and round and round she goes, and where she stops is right on the nose with number 11. Number 11, and that looks like it's Rob Nunn. Rob, congratulations, a repeat winner. We do appreciate your support and interest. We will get a prize off to you post-haste. And now, it's time for the canonical couplet for this episode. Are we ready?
Yes.
Here we go. A curse-encumbered household in the West, inspired of all the detective tales, is best. If you think you know the answer to this, jot it down in an email labeled Canonical Couplet and sent to comment@ihearofsherlock.com. If you are among the many listeners who have provided a correct answer and we choose your name, we'll send you a prize. Good luck.
Well, that's a good one. I'll bet that's one of the 60 adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
One of the 60, yes. We're knowing it. I haven't done a count to see how many stories we have actually used up in the canonical couplet game yet, because eventually we're going to run out. We can only do 60 shows on this kind of quiz show theme. So,
well, but you're missing the whole point. I mean, we just need to write more couplets. That's all.
Well, that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea. I mean, we can approach it from a different angle. It is only 2 lines after all, and there have to be many lines that can explain each canonical tale. So,
well, and we can change too. We could find crossovers between the Sherlock Holmes canon and Shakespeare, and just change this to something like Canonical Capulets.
Well, in that case, I think you might actually get some of them right each week. So, oh, Romeo. Well, in that case, we will leave you folks kind of staring out into the evening air on your balcony, waiting for the light to break beyond yon window. And in the meantime, I remain the ever romanticized Scott Monty.
And I'm still looking for my nurse. I'm Burt Wolder.
And together we say, The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.